Hi guys, it's time to start reading again, and we are on chapter 2 of Prince Caspian, and this is book 4 in our Chronicle series. Now, where we left yesterday, the kids were on their way back to school, like we are not, and something happened, something that they did not expect, and they landed somewhere new, somewhere different, and they have no idea where they are right now, so they are lost. I guess that's the best way. They just don't know. I think you guys have an idea of where they might be, but they don't know yet. Now, when we start reading chapter 2, there's going to be a couple words that you may not be familiar with. So I want to talk about them right now, so when you hear them, you won't be surprised. The first word is dais. And a dais is part of an area, like if we would go in and sit down for an assembly, and one end of the room has a raised area where the platform would be where somebody would talk, kind of similar like when we go to chapel. And when you see Mrs. Matthews up at the front leading us in chapel, that's a raised platform. So another word for that would be a dais. So kind of have that picture in your head when I'm talking about that word dais. Another word is very similar or very familiar in England, but we don't speak English. We speak American English. So it's not the word that we would use for this thing. So do you guys know? It would be helpful. Oh, there it goes. I have a light. So we know what this is. This is a flashlight, right? This is a flashlight. But in England, they would not call this a flashlight. They would call this a torch. So when you hear the word torch, you know it's something that gives us, it's going to work when it wants to work, I guess. It's something that gives us light. So an electric torch would be like this, like a flashlight. So words you're going to be looking for: dais, kind of a raised platform like what we see in chapel, and the word torch. So let's pick up on chapter 2 and see what starts to happen. So chapter 2, the ancient treasure house. And here we go. This wasn't a garden, said Susan presently. It was a castle, and this must have been the courtyard. I see what you mean, said Peter. Yeah, that is the remains of a tower, and there is where there used to be a flight of steps going to the top of the walls. And look, over there, the other steps, the broad and shallow ones, going up to the doorway. It must have been the door to the great hall. Ages ago, if you look at it, said Edmund. Yeah, ages ago, said Peter. I wish we could find out who the people were who lived here in this castle, and how long ago. It does give me an odd feeling, said Lucy. Does it? Said Peter, turning and looking hard at her. Because it does the same to me. It's the oddest feeling that has happened since this whole odd day. I wonder where we are and what it all means. While they were talking, they had crossed the courtyard and gone in the other doorway into what had been a hall. This was now very like the courtyard, for the roof had long since disappeared, and it was merely another space of grass and daisies, except that it was shorter and narrower, and the walls were higher. Across the far end, there was kind of a terrace about 3 feet higher than the rest. I wonder, was it really the hall? Said Susan. What is that terrace kind of thing? Why, you silly, said Peter, who had become strangely excited. Don't you see? This was where the dais was, the high table, where all of the kings and the great lords sat. Any think of you of our forgotten selves were once queens and kings in Narnia and sat on a dais just like that one in our great hall. In our castle at Cair Paravel, continued Susan in a dreamy and rather sing-songy voice, at the mouth of the great river of Narnia. How could I forget? How it all comes back, said Lucy. We could pretend we were in Cair Paravel now. This hall must have been very like the great hall we feasted in. But unfortunately, there is no feast, said Edmund. It's getting late, you know. Look how long the shadows are. And have you noticed that it isn't so hot? We shall need a campfire if we're going to spend the night here, said Peter. I've got matches. Let's go see if we can collect some dry wood. Everyone saw the need of this, and for the next half hour they were busy. The orchard through which they had first come into the ruins turned out not to be a good place for firewood. They tried the other side of the castle, passing by the hall by a very little side door into a maze of stony humps and hollows, which must have been passages and smaller rooms, but was now all nettles and wild roses. Beyond this, they found a wide gap in the castle wall and stepped through into a wood of darker and bigger trees, where they found dead branches and rotten wood and sticks and dry leaves and fir cones aplenty. They went to and fro with bundles until they had a good pile on the dais. At the fifth journey, they found the well, just outside the hall, hidden in weeds, but clean and fresh and deep. When they had cleared these away, the remains of the stone pavement ran halfway around it. Then the girls went out to pick some more apples, and the boys built the fire. On the dais, and fairly close to the corner between the two walls, which they thought would be the snuggest and warmest place, they had great difficulty in lighting it and used a lot of matches, but they succeeded in the end. Finally, all four sat down with their backs to the wall and their faces to the fire. They tried roasting some of the apples on the ends of sticks, but roast apples are not much good without sugar, and they are too hot to eat with your fingers till they are too cold to be worth eating. So they had to be content with themselves and have raw apples, which, as Edmund said, made one realize that school meals weren't so bad after all. I shouldn't mind a slice of thick bread and butter this minute, he added. But the spirit of adventure was rising in them all, and no one really wanted to be back at school. Shortly after the last apple had been eaten, Susan went out to the well to get another drink. When she came back, she was carrying something in her hand. Look, she said in a rather choking kind of voice. I found it by the well. She handed it to Peter and sat down. The others thought she looked and sounded as if she might start to cry. Edmund and Lucy eagerly bent forward to see what was in Peter's hand. A little bright thing that gleamed in the firelight. Well, I'm confused, said Peter, and his voice also sounded odd. Then he handed it to the others. All now saw what it was. A little chess knight, ordinary in size, but extraordinarily heavy because it was made of pure gold. And the eyes in the horse's head were two tiny little rubies. Or rather, one was, for the other had been knocked out. Why, said Lucy, it's exactly like one of the golden chessmen we used to play with when we were kings and queens at Cair Paravel. Cheer up, Sue, said Peter to his sister. I can't help it, said Susan. It brought back such lovely memories, and I remembered playing chess with the fauns and the good giants and the mer people singing in the sea and my beautiful horse and... Now, said Peter in quite a different voice, it's about time we four started using our brains. What about? Asked Edmund. Have none of you guessed where we are? Said Peter. Go on, said Lucy. I've felt it for hours that there is some wonderful mystery hanging over this place. Fire ahead, Peter, said Edmund. We're all listening. We are in the ruins of Cair Paravel itself, said Peter. But I say, replied Edmund, I mean, how do you make that out? This place has been ruined for ages. Look at those big trees growing up right next to the gates. Look at the very high stones. Anyone can see that nobody has lived here for hundreds of years. I know, said Peter. That is the difficulty. But let's leave that out for just a moment. I want to take points one by one. First point. This hall is exactly the same shape and size as our hall at Cair Paravel. Just picture a roof on it, and colored pavement instead of grass, and tapestries on the walls, and you get our royal banqueting hall. No one said anything. Second point, continued Peter. This castle well is exactly where our well was, a little to the south of the great hall, and it is exactly the same size and shape. Again, there was no reply. Third point, Susan has just found one of our old chessmen, or something as like one of them as 2 peas in a pod. Still, nobody answered. Fourth point, don't you remember it was this very day before the ambassadors came from the kings of Calamoran? Don't you remember planting the orchard outside the north gate of Cair Paravel? The greatest of all the woods people, Pomona herself, came to put good spells on it. It was those very decent little chaps, the moles, who did the actual digging. Can you have forgotten funny old Lilygloves, the chief mole, leaning on his spade and saying, "Believe me, your majesty, you'll be glad of these fruit one day"? And by Jove, he was right. I do, said Lucy, and she clapped her hands. But look here, Peter, said Edmund. This must be all wrong. To begin with, we didn't plant the orchard slap up against the gate. We wouldn't have been such fools. No, of course not, said Peter. But it has grown up to the gate since. And for another thing, said Edmund, Cair Paravel was not on an island. Yes, I've been wondering about that. But it was, a peninsula, jolly near an island. Couldn't have been made an island since our time. Somebody has dug a channel. But half a moment, said Edmund. You keep saying since our time. But it's only a year ago that we've been back from Narnia, and you want to make it out that in 1 year castles have fallen down, great forests have grown up, and little trees we saw planted ourselves have turned into a big old orchard, and goodness knows what else. It's impossible. There is one thing, said Lucy. If this is Cair Paravel, there ought to be a door at the end of this dais. In fact, we ought to be sitting with our backs against it at this very moment. You know, the door that led down to the treasure chamber? I suppose there isn't a door, said Peter, getting up. That wall behind them was a great mass of ivy. We can soon find out, said Edmund, taking one of the sticks that they had laid ready for putting on the fire. He began beating against the ivied wall. Tap, tap, with the stick against the stone, and again, tap, tap, and then, all at once, boom, boom, which was quite a different sound, a hollow, wooden sound. Great Scott, said Edmund. We must clear this ivy, said Peter. Oh, let's leave it alone, said Susan. We can try it in the morning. If we've got to spend the night here, I don't want an open door at my back and a great black hole that anything might come out of. Besides, the draught and the damp, it'll soon be dark. Susan, how can you? Said Lucy with a reproachful glance. But both of the boys were too much excited to take any notice of Susan's advice. They worked at the ivy with their hands and with Peter's pocket knife till the knife broke. After that, they used Edmund's. Soon the whole place where it had been sitting was covered in ivy, and at last the door was cleared. Locked. Of course, said Peter. But the wood's all rotten, said Edmund. We can pull it to bits in no time, and it will make extra firewood. Come on. Pages are sticking together. It took them longer than they had expected, and before they had done, the great hall had grown dusky, and the first star or two had come out overhead. Susan was not the only one who felt a slight shudder as the boys stood above the pile of splintered wood, rubbing the dirt off of their hands and staring into the cold, dark opening they had made. "Now for a torch." "Oh, what is the good?" said Susan. And Edmund said, "I'm not saying it now," Edmund interrupted. I still don't understand, but we can settle that later." "I suppose you're coming down, Peter?" "We must," said Peter. "Cheer up, Susan. It's no good behaving like little kids now that we're back in Narnia. You're a queen here. And anyway, no one could go to sleep with a mystery like this on their minds." They tried to use long sticks as torches, but this was not a success. If you held them with the lighted end up, they went out. And if you held them the other way, they scorched your hand and the smoke got in your eyes. In the end, they had to use Edmund's electric torch. Luckily, it had been a birthday present less than a week ago, and the battery was still almost new. He went first with a light. Then came Lucy, then Susan, and Peter brought up the rear. I've come to the top of the steps," said Edmund. "Count them," said Peter. 1, 2, 3, said Edmund as he went cautiously down, and so up to 16 and the bottom, and he shouted back. This really must be Cair Paravel," said Lucy. "There were 16. Nothing more was said till all four were standing in a knot together at the foot of the stairway. Then Edmund flashed his torch slowly around. "Ooh," said all the children at once, for now all knew that it was indeed the ancient treasure chamber of Cair Paravel, where they had once reigned as kings and queens of Narnia. There was a kind of path up the middle, as it might be like in a greenhouse, and along each side at intervals stood rich suits of armor, like knights guarding the treasures. In between the suits of armor and on each side of the path were shelves covered with precious things, necklaces and arm rings and finger rings and golden bowls and dishes and long tusks of ivory, brooches and coronets and chains of gold and heaps of unset stones lying piled anyhow as if they were marbles or potatoes. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds, topazes, amethysts. Under the shelf stood a great chest of oak, strengthened with iron bars and heavily padlocked, and it was bitterly cold, and so still that they could hear themselves breathing. And the treasures were so covered with dust that unless they realized where they were and remembered most of the things, they would have hardly known they were even treasures. There was something sad and a little frightening about the place, because it all seemed so forsaken and long ago. That was why nobody said anything for at least a minute. Then, of course, they began walking about and picking up things to look at. It was like meeting with very old friends. If you had been there, you would have heard things like, "Oh, look, our coronation rings. Do you remember first wearing this? Why, this is the little brooch we all thought was lost. I say, isn't that the armor you wore in the great tournament in the Lone Islands? Do you remember the dwarf making that for me? Do you remember drinking out of that horn? Do you remember? Do you remember?" But suddenly Edmund said, "Look here, we mustn't waste the battery. Goodness knows how long we might need it. Hadn't we better take what we want and get out again?" "We must take the gifts," said Peter, for long ago at Christmas in Narnia, he and Susan and Lucy had been given certain presents which they valued more than their whole kingdom. Edmund had no gift because he was not with them at the time. This was his own fault, and you can read about it in the other book. They all agreed with Peter and walked up the path to the wall at the far end of the treasure chamber, and there, sure enough, the gifts were still hanging. Lucy's was the smallest, for it was only a little bottle, but the bottle was made of diamond instead of glass, and it was still more than half full of the magic cordial which would heal almost every wound and every illness. Lucy said nothing and looked very solemn as she took her gift down from its place and slung the belt over her shoulder and once more felt the bottle at her side where it used to hang in the old days. Susan's gift had been a bow, arrow, and a horn. The bow was still there, and the ivory quiver full of well-weathered arrows. But, "Oh, Susan," said Lucy, "where is the horn?" "Oh, bother," said Susan after she had thought for a moment. "I remember now. I took it with me the last day of all, the day we went hunting the white stag. It must have gotten lost when we blundered back into that other place. Oh, that place, England. I mean," Edmund whistled. It was indeed a shattering loss, for it was an enchanted horn, and whenever you blew it, help was certain to come to you wherever you were. "Just the sort of thing that might come in handy in a place like this," said Edmund. "Never mind," said Susan. "I've still got the bow," and she took it. "Won't the string be perished, Sue?" said Peter. But whether by some magic in the air or the treasure chamber or not, the bow was still in working order. Archery and swimming were the things that Susan was good at. In a moment she had bent the bow, and she gave it one little pluck to the string. It twanged, a chirping twang that vibrated through the whole room, and that one small noise brought back the old days to the children's minds more than anything that had happened yet. All the battles and hunts and the feasts came rushing into their heads together. Then she unstrung the bow again and slung it in the quiver at her side. Next, Peter took down his gift, the shield with the great red lion on it and the royal sword. He blew and rapped them on the floor to get the dust off. He fitted the shield on his arm and slung the sword by his side. He was afraid at first that it might be rusty and stick to the sheath, but it was not so. With one swift motion, he drew it and held it up, shining in the torchlight. "It is my sword, Rendon," he said. "With it, I killed the wolf." This was a new tone in his voice, and the others all felt that he was really Peter, High King, again. Then, after a while, and a slight pause, everyone remembered that they must save the battery. They climbed the stair again and made up a good fire and lay down together for the warmth. The ground was very hard and uncomfortable, but in the end, they fell asleep. So now they know where they are. They know they're in Narnia, but it's not the same Narnia that they left. I wonder how many other changes that they are going to come across before the story ends. They're not the same kings and queens, and Narnia has changed. Maybe we'll find out a little bit in chapter 3, called The Dwarf. For now, I hope you guys are doing well, enjoying your family, and having lots of fun. I'll see you soon. Bye.